You're listening to Blackpool Church Podcast. Join us for our Sunday gatherings to make friends, explore faith and encounter God. Visit our website, blackpool.church. This is the Talk Archive.
We are continuing our series, which is called Where's Jesus In? And it's an overview of the Old Testament, and we're looking for where Jesus is seen in some of these books that on surface reading might look like they have nothing to do with him. And it's all about how the Bible is one big overarching story, all pointing towards Jesus. And today we're going to be having a look at the book of Joshua, and the question that I want to ask is God violent? That's the question that we're thinking about today. Is God violent? The first house I ever lived in after I left my mum and dad's house was like a 3-bed terrace house on a street in Durham. And it was a little bit of a dump in many ways, but I really liked it. We had a good time there, me and my housemate Johnny. And I remember at the first sort of Christmas holiday that we came round to, we were both going back to our mums and dad's for a few weeks. And so we had a fair bit of sorting out to do in the house. And we'd not kind of coordinated this well. We left everything to stack up, as you can imagine, with a student house. We were charging around, we were cleaning, we were packing, we were sorting through stuff, we were trying to get things in the right room, and we realised we just didn't have enough time to sort out the whole house. And so what we did is we came up with a plan. And the plan was very simple. We'd take all of the dirty dishes that had mounted up over time, we'd put them in a cupboard, we'd close the cupboard, and then we'd go back to our parents for the Christmas holiday, and we would deal with that in several weeks' time.
Good plan.
As Phil has noticed, this is an eminently sensible and mature thing to do, and I'm sure you've all realised that, but actually, as it turns out, it wasn't the most sensible thing to do, and of course when we got back, all sorts of things were growing on this like mound of dirty dishes that had been left for weeks in a darkened cupboard. It was a nightmare. But we did it with kind of obvious rationale and justification. It's like, I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, I don't have the desire to sort this out. But it turned out to be a bad idea because there are just things that you can't avoid forever. You can't put them off endlessly, hoping that nothing bad will come of it. There are things that you can't just avoid. And when it comes to the book of Joshua, I think we find ourselves in a similar sort of predicament. It's like there's an issue in the book of Joshua which it would be so tempting to just avoid. It's an issue where you think, oh man, this is just a bit gross, a bit dirty. Maybe we can just put it in a cupboard and close the door and hope it's all okay. I might think I don't have the time, or the energy, or the desire to look at this. And that's the issue of violence in the Old Testament. Basically, throughout the book of Joshua and other similar books around it, there are numerous stories where God's people are commanded to sweep into towns or cities and to destroy everything and everybody in the place. And my guess is, whether you're a Christian or an atheist, or whether you're just kind of new to faith or exploring things, you've probably heard of rumours of some really awful things in the Bible. And as we make our way through this series called Where's Jesus In? A legitimate question would be, where's Jesus in that? Where is Jesus going to be found in a passage like that? Where would we find Jesus at work in the slaughter of a whole community? How on earth could we reconcile Jesus' teaching on loving your enemies with the God who commands people to attack their enemies? If God is so good, why is it that he seems to do things that feel so bad? And so today we're going to jump into one particular episode and think a bit about what it means to respond to biblical violence and what it might tell us about God. Are you up for that? Yeah? You didn't ask for it, so I'm just interested. Let me read to you from Joshua 5, and Joshua 5 and 6. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city, once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark, and on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go straight up." On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you'll make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasure." When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. It was all sounding good, wasn't it? It was all sounding absolutely Sunday school appropriate. We could have made the models of the whole thing. We could have had a go with the little trumpets if we wanted to. And then it said they destroyed with the sword every living thing. Men, women, young, old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. See, lots of us are probably comfortable with the idea that soldiers are sometimes killed in battle, even if they weren't in charge. Lots of us are probably okay with the idea that sometimes violence is necessary in order to protect other people, and sometimes that might involve people suffering who weren't directly responsible. But what I suspect none of us are naturally comfortable with is the idea of children being intentionally killed in battle. So when we read texts like this, the question is what we're supposed to do with them. What we're meant to do with it. In the sort of 100 or so AD, there was a theologian called Marcion, and he hit up against this problem. He said what you should do is you should just cut the Old Testament out of your Bible, just rip it off and bin that, because the God there is very different to Jesus. And then he thought, you've got a problem, because lots of the Old Testament references, lots of the New Testament references the Old Testament. So I better cut those bits out as well. He kept cutting and kept cutting. In the end, he didn't have 4 Gospels. He had 1 left, but only half of that one just had a couple of scattered letters. And the church said, "We think you're probably a heretic." He was excommunicated. So I think that's probably not the one. I'm thinking it's not the one for us. So what could we do? Well, I've got 5 tips about what we do when we come across passages like this. And the first tip is we need to get used to it. We need to get used to it. If you're sat here this morning thinking, "Oh, finally, And he's going to give me a talk. It's going to explain away all of the most difficult bits of violence in the Old Testament, and then I'm just going to think, oh, brilliant, I get it all now. It all makes complete sense. Thanks. I'm so sorry. That's not going to happen. Like, I hate to disappoint you, but it's not going to happen. The violent passages in the Old Testament are some of the most challenging in the whole Bible, and they're not just about to go away. Instead, it's a lifelong exercise, wrestling with texts like this to stretch and grow our faith. Many of these passages that I've looked up in preparation for this talk, I just hold up my hands and say, I'm not quite sure what's going on there. I don't know quite what to make of it. But notice one thing. When you're wrestling with a passage like that, if you're desperately hoping that there's some explanation that will make this thing feel right, then in all likelihood, your feelings have already decided what the right and wrong of the situation is. All that's left is for God to just catch up and fit in. But that's not going to work. And so these passages, it's not just that we need to get used to them because they're not going away. We need to get used to them because they're a tool. They're a tool for challenging us, unsettling our ideas of who we think God is and how he operates, and stretching us to recognize that we don't completely understand him. We don't fully understand what he's like. It draws us deeper in. We need to get used to it. That's the first tip. Second tip is, it's not a manual. This is not a manual. Okay, so you know, in the 90s, if you were alive, that we all watched those like stunt TV shows where people would like ride a BMX off a house on fire into a paddling pool or something like that. And before any of those clips were shown, a thing would come up that would say, "This is being performed by professionals. Do not try this at home." And it was obvious that they weren't professionals. You can't be a professional. It's being set on fire. But there's still something in it, right? You shouldn't try that at home. And I think much of the Bible needs to come with a warning that says, do not try this at home. This is not a thing for you to act out. It's not a manual. You know, the passage I read to you from Joshua, this is about a very specific group of people. They're slaves who have been held in slavery for 400 years before finally being liberated. They've wandered around in a desert, lost and presumably impoverished, and their whole generation has died, and so the people that we come across have been born in a tent somewhere in the desert, finally hoping that they'd be allowed to have a place where they can live and they can call home. And last time I checked, that's not my life story. That's not my thing. I haven't had that experience. And there might be some analogies, there are definitely going to be lessons that we can take from these passages to guide us, but we need to be very careful about thinking that it's an instruction book that I could just read off and then copy, as though violence is the norm in the Bible and God would approve of it in general. Beware of the temptation of thinking that every encouraging verse in the Bible is spoken to you. It might not be, but God can still speak through it. Last week, for instance, Sam spoke brilliantly on the book of Leviticus. And the book of Leviticus makes some really clear claims about how people are meant to live universally, often. But the book of Joshua is not like that. It's a different kind of story. And we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that it would apply to us one-to-one. It's not a manual, that's the second tip. But the third tip then would be we need to notice the characters. It's like, if the book of Joshua isn't a manual, you might ask, well, what is it? What kind of book is this that we're reading, and what's the point in it? And I think the answer is, Joshua is like one section, one chapter of an epic narrative. It's a story that's being told over hundreds of pages, over hundreds of years, and Joshua is a part of that story. And as you'll know, the most important thing about stories are the characters. You think about your favourite film or something, and you picture your favourite film. You don't picture a plot somehow. You picture a character, a person from that story. And so as we read texts like Joshua, we should pay really close attention to the characters in case their experiences have something to tell us. I want to draw your attention just to one character in the story. Her name is Rahab. Rewind the story a little bit, and Joshua, with all the people, millions of people, they are about to enter the promised land that God has said he'll give to them. And they know that the first place they're going to hit up against, where they're going to get into a battle, is this city called Jericho. Joshua thinks, why don't I send a couple of spies in to see what Jericho's like? That way we'll have a better chance when it all kicks off. In the spies go. But as they head in, the king of Jericho, he hears that some spies have come, and he starts looking for them. You can imagine that would be a pretty scary situation to be in a city where you know you're being hunted down. And so I imagine they're like frantically searching around for somebody who might take them in. And somebody does take them in. She's called Rahab. She's a prostitute. She lives in the walls of the city. And she gives these people rescue. She saves them. The king and his men turn up at Rahab's house. They say, we know you've got these guys. And she hides them. She says, I think they're left already. and they fall for it. And then they make a deal together. They say, because you've spared our life, then when the city falls, we'll spare your life and the life of your families. And that's interesting, because then what ends up happening is that as we read the narrative of the battle, the very sentence after, we hear that women and their families are killed without mercy. Literally the very next sentence, we hear of a woman and her family who were spared. I don't think that can be a coincidence. I think the author is trying to do something. He's trying to communicate something to us. You know, we might say, oh, maybe Rahab is just a bit of a kind of irrelevant character. It's convenient that she gave them safe lodgings for a bit, but it doesn't really mean anything. But that can't be true. You skip forward to the New Testament. Jesus' friend Matthew is writing a genealogy. He's writing Jesus' family tree. All of these ancestors of Jesus. I'll tell you who's not on the list. Joshua isn't on the list. The great military leader taking the city. No, doesn't make the list. Moses doesn't make the list. You know, incredible leader, friend of God, spoke face to face with God. No, doesn't make the list. Aaron, maybe, Moses' brother. It's like the first priest, the one who has this role of mediating between God and people. Surely he'll be one of Jesus' ancestors. No, doesn't make the list. But I'll tell you who does make the list. Rahab. She makes the list. The kind of enemy prostitute living in the walls of the city. The nobody who surely would be, if anyone kind of sums up God's enemies, maybe it would be her. No, she makes the list of Jesus' family. Jesus' great-great-great-great-great-grandmama or something is Rahab, this Canaanite woman. That must mean something. God must be saying something through them. And I think all it could possibly mean is that even in the midst of situations where human sin has led to extreme judgment, God is still working to bring about good. He's still finding ways to love his enemies so that he can find a family member in the city while he's there and choose to associate himself with her. That's significant. And I wondered actually, just today, whether there might be someone who you have this sense of being somebody who would be like. I think it was really the church's enemy, actually. I don't know why you'd be here, but I have this sense that maybe there would be somebody for whom you'd say, I don't like the church, I can't deal with the church, I hate the church. And today, I think God is wanting to say, you can come and be part of the family. You know, there's not a battle going on here. You can be part of the family. Let me give you tip 4. Tip 4 is you need to get the big picture. So imagine somebody gives you a puzzle for your birthday or Christmas or something like that, and you're happy with the puzzle, no doubt. And what you find in the evening or something, you think, I'm going to make my puzzle. Now there's a method people use, isn't there? You search through the pieces and you find edges. You probably find corners as well, if you can find your corners. You do the edge, and then maybe you also look for like the next easiest things. Maybe there's something really distinctive in the picture, bright coloured thing or something. Right, we find all of the bits that match the colour, and then you do that easy bit, and then you do the next easiest bit, and then eventually you can kind of fit in some of the harder bits, like the sky or whatever, around it. Okay, now nobody does a puzzle by opening the box and trying to find the hardest puzzle piece in the box. It's just blue, and you can't tell if it's sky or water. It's got no distinguishing marks on it, not an edge, not a corner. Nobody goes finding that piece and says, tell you what, I'm going to start there. I'm going to build my puzzle from that. Nobody does that. Similarly, when people do find that piece, they don't say, oh, I don't know where that goes, so I'll build it. And nobody gets the piece and then gets maybe like a microscope out and thinks, well, I tell you what, maybe if I look really, really closely at it, then suddenly I'll figure out where it's meant to go. No, nobody does that. And that's a picture for us of how we should approach challenging passages in the Old Testament. It's like when we come across these difficult passages, we shouldn't try to build everything on the basis of them. We also shouldn't obsess about them as though if we just look closer and closer and closer, finally we'll figure it out. No, instead we need to take a bigger view of what's going on in Scripture in general, and as we do that, we build the puzzle and find its place. So, for instance, if you were to zoom out a little bit from our passage, then we discover that all of the people who theoretically have been killed can't have been. And that's because they appear again later in the story. So there are various people who, on the surface level reading, they get completely wiped out, but then later somebody's told not to marry them. You think, well, if you're marrying someone, in all likelihood, you haven't previously killed them. That's a given, isn't it? There's also people, raiding parties, who turn up from some of these groups who in theory have completely been destroyed. And what's happening is it's like there's a majority report, as theologians call it. It's like, here's the summary of the situation that tells us something important. God is victorious, his people are victorious. And that's the headline. But then you see the minority report, like the details that are going on within it. There's a bit more detail. There's Rahab, there's others, there's people who didn't experience this in the way it looks on first reading. Zoom out a little bit further. There's a bit more context for us. Again, what we realise is that this is a campaign of driving out. Of driving out. It's not a genocide or something like that. For instance, in Exodus 30 it says, little by little I'll drive people out before you until you take possession of the land. You think, well, that still doesn't seem like an ideal situation. That's okay, well, we're just driving them all out. But again, this is context specific. There's a people who've been held in slavery for hundreds of years, and finally they find freedom. They have to live as nomads. And for them to have a home, somebody needs to give way. And it's better that the rich and powerful give way than the poorest. Zoom out again a little bit further, and we realise that the narrative of driving out the conquest of Israel is like part 2 of the Exodus. I only recently learned that the Canaanite warlords in places like Jericho, they were paid for by Egypt. They were effectively working as a buffer zone, protecting Egypt from enemies further afield. And so when God's people leave Egypt, firstly they find freedom from that nation, but then they also need hope from that nation. They come out from an oppressive regime, and they find hope in the people working alongside them to oppress them. This is like part 2 of liberation, rather than just a random attacking of some innocent third parties. Zoom out even further, and we get to see some of the context of the nations that come under God's judgment. That it's like the most horrendous evil you can imagine. We're talking about like forced religious prostitution, bestiality, child sacrifice by fire. And God is patient with these people for generation after generation, but ultimately he brings about judgment. It says in Genesis 15, in the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So what's happening there is some 500 plus years earlier, God is already recognizing an evil and a corruption in a nation. But he gives them 500 years to turn back, to start to live right. And eventually, after all that patience, judgment comes. And the sin of these nations, it falls into their own laps. And that affects them, and it does affect their family, and it does affect their children. But it doesn't start from God's character, his goodness, or his judgment. It starts from human sin. And God demonstrates relentless patience in the face of it. So as we zoom out, and zoom out, and zoom out, and zoom out, and zoom out, we get a context, a picture of these challenges. It's not like some powerful land-grabbing army sweeping in to kick out some innocent villagers. It's an oppressed nation, having spent hundreds of years in slavery, finally finding somewhere that they can call home. And the people who've been oppressing them, in some cases, decide to stay and fight, and God brings judgment. They reap, ultimately, what they've sown. So, what are we supposed to make of all of this? That's the last question. What would we here in Blackpool be meant to make of violence in the Old Testament? You might think this is all very interesting. You might think it's not very interesting. But you might ask, what does this mean for me? Well, there are a few things. Firstly, I hope that you can have some confidence about approaching some of the most challenging texts in the Bible and knowing that God can speak through them and that you can approach them without fear. There's an interest, there's a depth, there's a nuance to be sought out as we read these passages. So I hope we can have confidence. Go for it. Find the worst. Show me. I'll be interested. But secondly, I think this passage should give us hope, actually. I think it should give us hope. So there's this pattern that runs throughout the Bible. And the pattern is that what God does in a limited way in the Old Testament, he does in an unlimited way in the New Testament. What he does just for a few people in the Old Testament, he can do for anybody through Jesus. And that is especially true of the promised land. It's like physical land that people scrapped over and God gave one particular group of people. It's just like a sign of an infinite promised land, a home with God that he wants to make available to every person through Jesus. It's like the writer of Hebrews. He's talking about people like Abraham and Moses, and he says this: all these people were still living by faith when they died. They didn't receive the things they promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting they were foreigners and strangers on earth. You are like a foreigner and a stranger on earth because God has promised you a place in heaven that you can have a home with him. And the promised land that he fought for with his people is just like a sign of that, just a glimpse of that. The writer goes on to say, if they'd been thinking of a country they'd left, they would have just come back to it. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. He's prepared a city for them. This is a story about a group of people being given a home. And through it, God is saying he will make a home with him for anybody who wants it. And what he says is that it can include unlikely people, like Rahab. Even if you think you're the enemy, the last person who would ever be able to be at home with God, it can include you. And God will wait patiently. He has waited patiently to bring this about, hoping that every person comes to salvation. But ultimately, he won't let evil triumph forever. And that's a good thing. He'd be a monster if he did. So let me end with this. At the start of the reading that I read, there's this moment where Joshua meets this guy with a drawn sword. And he asks the guy the obvious question that you would ask were you to be going into battle against somebody. Are you for us, or are you for our enemies? And the guy says, neither. Take off your sandals. You're on holy ground. Here's the point. This story and the glimpse that it's showing us of God's kingdom is not about whether God is going to join Joshua's team and destroy their enemies. It's about whether Joshua is going to join God's team to be on his side. And I want to ask you today the question: are you willing to sign up to what God is doing? He is building a kingdom here in Blackpool and across the far coast and across our nation, across the world. He's building his kingdom. And it's not so much will God fight for you, but will you be part of his kingdom? Will you be on his team? Will you be for him? That's the question. Should we pray? Let's stand.